That Saturday morning dawned with a deep, clean blue sky, the kind typical of early November in the Serra da Mantiqueira mountains. Carlos Eduardo Martins, 34 years old, was adjusting the child carrier on his back, checking each buckle to ensure it was secure. Clara, his 2-year-old daughter, gazed at the horizon with an expression that mixed curiosity with a child's serenity. Their white car was parked beside a simple wooden fence, where a thin dog watched them in scents. The wind carried the fresh scent of grass and damp earth, a remnant of the previous night's rain. Among his friends, Carlos was known for turning any free day into an adventure. A mechanic by trade, he spent his weeks surrounded by parts, grease, and the metallic clang of tools. But on weekends, he traded his overalls for hiking boots and a backpack. He knew many of the trails in the Mantiqueira, some simple, others more challenging. Pedra da Fenda, their destination that morning, wasn't the most popular tourist spot, and that was precisely why he loved it. The path required about 2 hours of hiking over steep terrain, through dense woods and clearings that opened up to views of deep valleys. Around 10 o'clock, as he adjusted the cap on his head, Carlos was approached by a couple of hikers coming down the same trail. The woman holding a water bottle asked if he was heading to the top. He smiled, said yes, and mentioned he wanted to show his daughter the view. The brief conversation was marked by laughter and quick goodbyes. The couple continued on their way, and Carlos resumed his steady pace with Clara swaying gently in the carrier. The silence of the forest was broken only by the sound of their footsteps, the distant song of a thrush, and the soft gurgle of water running somewhere nearby. The sun filtered through the canopy, creating golden patches on the leaf-strewn ground. With every turn, the path seemed to grow narrower, lined with moss-covered stones and small roots snaking across the trail. Carlos, an experienced hiker, knew not to rush. The climb demanded breath and attention. The last person to see them was a farmer tending to a pasture near the base of the mountain. He would later recount seeing the figure of a man with a child on his back, slowly disappearing into the shadows of the woods. After that, no one heard from them again. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped quickly, as it often does in the mountains. The white car remained in the same spot, parked by the fence, its rear window fogged by the evening chill. A local resident, accustomed to seeing hikers come and go, grew concerned by the prolonged absence of the father and child. Approaching the car, he saw it was locked, with no signs of their return. He knocked on the door of a neighboring farm and called the police station in São Bento do Sapucaí, who then alerted the fire department. Night had already fallen over the mountains when the first flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Local volunteers joined the professionals, guided by ropes and improvised markers made from strips of cloth. The biting wind made the branches sway, and a fog began to shroud the first few meters of the trail. The next morning, the search intensified. A fire department helicopter flew over the more open areas, but the dense vegetation made it nearly impossible to spot anything from above. Search dogs were brought in to navigate the narrow stretches between rocks and ravines. It was then that they found it, about 3 kilometers from the car. An empty plastic bottle and a partially torn cookie wrapper. The fresh mud on their edges indicated they had been dropped there recently. Despite the effort, with each passing day, the weather became an enemy. A fine rain made the ground slippery, and the fog covered everything like a thick blanket. Many parts of the trail bordered precipices hidden by foliage, and the crevices between rocks were deep enough to swallow someone without a trace. For 3 weeks, the mountain was scoured. Residents, experienced mountaineers, and even tourists volunteered. But as time went on, the activity dwindled. On the 22nd day, the search was officially called off. All that remained was the car, the memory of their last conversations, and a mystery that began to settle over the small community. Maria Helena, Carlos's wife, refused to accept that they were gone for good. She would spend hours on her porch staring at the distant mountains, as if at any moment she might see him emerge from the dirt road. Clara's clothes remained folded in the closet, and the child carrier from the car stayed in its place, a silent message that hope was not yet lost. For most, however, the disappearance became just another unsolved story of the Mantiqueira. Until 7 years later, something unexpected would change everything. The winter of 2003 in the Serra da Mantiqueira was drier than usual, but the early mornings still brought a breath-stealing cold. On a Saturday in July, 3 young climbers from Campos do Jordão decided to explore a little-known route near the border with Minas Gerais. Their destination wasn't the famous Pedra da Fenda, but a series of tall, narrow rock formations that, from a distance, looked like the columns of an ancient fortress. The group, consisting of 25-year-old Rafael, 27-year-old Daniel, and 24-year-old Lucas, were experienced sport climbers who often sought out less-traveled spots to practice. That day they carried ropes, carabiners, helmets, and cameras to document their journey. A steady wind blew, carrying the scent of dry leaves mixed with the light aroma of eucalyptus. The ground was covered with broken branches and patches of hardened mud. As they ascended a steep section, Daniel was the first to notice a vertical crevice between 2 large rocks. The opening seemed too narrow for an adult to pass through, but there was enough space to see the bottom, about 10 feet below. The midday sun partially illuminated the interior, revealing a light-colored object wedged between the stone walls. "Is there something down there?" he said, crouching down for a better look. Raphael came closer and, as his eyes focused, he recognized the familiar shape of a child's hiking carrier. The beige fabric was stained with dark earth, but its blue details were still visible despite the wear. The aluminum frame seemed intact, but dry leaves had collected in the seat and in the folds of the fabric. Lucas, curious, took out his camera and snapped a few photos. The images clearly showed the carrier, wedged in as if it had been left there a long time ago. Beside it, hanging by its strap, was a small child's coat of light-colored wool stiffened by moisture. In the carrier's side pocket, a metallic object gleamed. It was a flashlight, covered in rust. At the bottom of the seat lay a still-sealed package of candy, its plastic yellowed with time. The discovery changed the mood on the trail. The laughter and lively conversation gave way to a heavy silence. The 3 men looked at each other, aware that this scene did not fit the adventure they had planned for the day. Raphael was the first to suggest they call the police. They knew that in cases like this, any disturbance could compromise a future investigation. The call was made from high on the mountain, where the cell signal flickered in and out as the wind rustled the treetops. 2 hours later, a team arrived bringing longer ropes and safety equipment. The police officers and firefighters descended cautiously, clearing away leaves and debris to get a better look. There was no sign of human remains or any other direct evidence. The position of the carrier suggested it might have been dragged there by a fall or a landslide. However, the crevice was narrow and difficult to access, which raised questions about how the object had ended up in that exact position, stuck between the rocks as if it had been carefully placed. When the photos were shown to the Martins family, the reaction was immediate. Maria Helena instantly recognized the model and the wear marks on the lower part. The blue on the side pockets and the small torn tag on the left strap were identical to the original. To follow every detail of this investigation and understand how the mystery unfolded over the years, be sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss the next parts of this true story that continues to intrigue all of Brazil. Now, let's continue. The news of the discovery spread quickly. In less than 24 hours, the case that seemed buried in time was back on the front pages of newspapers in Taubaté, Campos do Jordão, and São Bento do Sapucaí. Local TV programs replayed old footage from the 1996 search. Helicopters flying over the mountain, volunteers in a line passing ropes from hand to hand, and a younger Maria Helena, her face drawn, pleading with them not to give up. The renewed attention brought dormant memories to the surface. Seu Antonio, a 72-year-old farmer, remembered clearly seeing Carlos and his daughter pass by on the dirt road that morning. He had been mending his fence when the two disappeared onto the trail. He seemed calm, he recounted, as if he knew the way well. Dona Ivone, who had prepared meals for the volunteers back then, could still recall the smell of coffee and warm bread in her kitchen, as the radio broadcasted updates on the search. Some of the volunteers from 1996 returned to Pedra da Fenda to watch the new efforts. Among them was Paulo Sergio, a local tour guide. He said that at the time the fog was so thick you sometimes couldn't see the tip of your own boot. We moved slowly, afraid of stepping into the void. Any mistake could have been your last. He also remembered the frigid nights when their makeshift tents trembled in the wind, and the sound of rain drumming on the tin roof of a shed they used for shelter. Despite the emotion of revisiting the site, Paulo acknowledged that the 2003 discovery raised more questions than it answered. If the carrier was here, how did no one see it before? This spot is off the main route, but it's not impossible to reach. Did they try to take a shortcut? Did they fall from above? While the official team took measurements and photographed every detail of the crevice, curious onlookers gathered at the base of the trail. Some had come from neighboring towns just to see the spot where the carrier had been found. The city had to increase the presence of municipal guards to prevent anyone from trying to access the area on their own. At Maria Helena's house, the activity was constant. Reporters knocked on the door asking for interviews, and old friends brought back memories from before the disappearance. On her kitchen table still lay the photos she had shown investigators. Carlos smiling beside his car, Clara in the same wool coat found with the carrier, and pictures from other hikes in the mountains in previous years. Even with the support, there was a quiet tension. Every person who entered the house seemed to measure their words as if afraid that any comment might reopen deep wounds. Maria Helena, despite her exhaustion, spoke with clarity. She wanted answers, but she was prepared to accept whatever came as long as it was the truth. The investigation also drew the attention of trail safety experts. One of them, a forestry engineer, analyzed topographical maps and suggested that the area where the carrier was found could be a drainage point for debris during heavy rains. It's not impossible for an object to be displaced and end up wedged in a crevice, he explained, but the position in which it was found suggests it didn't roll very far. It's as if it stopped there shortly after the disappearance. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate on local networks. Some said other objects had been found and not disclosed. Others believed the carrier might have been moved recently. None of these versions were ever confirmed. The police remained silent on the details of the new search, stating only that their work in the mountains was ongoing. As the days passed, the mountain once again seemed to bear the weight of its history. The cold wind that blew through the trees carried a different kind of suns, as if every stone held a piece of the answer everyone was looking for. For many, this wasn't just an investigation into a disappearance, but a reunion with a painful chapter in the life of the Mantiqueira. A new official search was organized. For 3 weeks, rescue teams, now with more modern equipment, examined the area around the crevice. Drones flew overhead, cameras were inserted into smaller fissures, and experienced climbers rappelled down nearby cliffs. But no other trace was found, no clothes, no objects, and certainly no human remains. The absence of answers only fueled the speculation. Some believed Carlos and Ana Clara had gotten lost and fallen into some unreachable place. Others thought the carrier might have come loose during a fall, getting stuck between the rocks while they continued to tumble. There were also those who suspected an attempt to find shelter, with the carrier left behind while the father searched for a way out. For Maria Helena, however, the discovery brought a strange kind of relief. It wasn't the ending she had hoped for, but it was the first concrete proof since 1996 that they had indeed made it farther into the mountains. Even without definitive answers, the image of the child carrier wedged in the crevice became the symbol of an interrupted story forever etched into the memory of all who knew the family. As soon as the discovery of the child's carrier seat gained traction, theories began to swirl. In the cafes of Campos do Jordão and the hushed conversations of Taubaté, everyone seemed to have their own version of the truth. Some came from people who knew the mountains well. Others were mere speculation, based only on what was printed in the newspapers. The official line of investigation, as far as anyone knew, still centered on the possibility that Carlos and Ana Clara had gotten lost and, in an attempt to find an alternative path, had ended up in dangerous terrain. The Pedra da Fenda, while beautiful, is surrounded by areas of dense forest and steep drops. In many places, the ground is covered by a thick blanket of dry leaves hiding holes or loose stones. One false step, especially with a child on your back, could lead to a serious fall. Another working hypothesis was that they might have been caught by a sudden change in the weather. In 1996, ecotourism in the region was still in its infancy, and trail markings were minimal. A cold front or a sudden storm could have easily obscured the paths, making it impossible to return to the car before nightfall. Those who participated in the initial search recalled that, in the first few days, the mountains were shrouded in a fog so thick that flashlights barely illuminated a few feet ahead. However, some experienced mountaineers questioned the fact that the carrier seat had been found in 2003 in a nearly pristine condition. If it had been exposed to 7 years of wind and rain, it should have been far more deteriorated or displaced. This gave rise to the theory that it might have been moved into that crevice later, either by human hands or a recent landslide. When asked about these hypotheses, Maria Helena avoided speculation. "I just want to know how and why this happened," she would repeat. But in private conversations with close friends, she admitted that the position of the carrier seat also seemed strange to her. Meanwhile, the new search team worked to map the area around the crevice. They identified small, narrow passages, some leading to sheer rock faces that were difficult to climb. Others ending at the edge of cliffs dropping more than 30 feet. In one of these passages, just a few meters from where the seat was found, there were old signs of erosion. The hardened soil bore marks that suggested something heavy had once slid down, but time had erased any telling details. Investigators also spoke with longtime residents. One of them, who lived on a farm about 2 kilometers from the site, said he remembered hearing distant screams on the day of the disappearance. But at the time, he had dismissed them as the echoes of hikers calling out to each other. This vague memory, however, reignited debates about what might have happened in those first few hours after Carlos and Ana Clara entered the forest. Some local guides argued that if they had fallen in a hard-to-reach spot, it was possible the father's body had remained hidden, while the lighter, unattached carrier seat became wedged between the rocks. Others claimed that given its position and the fact that the jacket and flashlight were still inside, the fall must have been short, not a plunge of dozens of meters. Time passed, and no new clues emerged. The 2003 search, despite being more technologically advanced than the one in 1996, ran into the same obstacles: fog, cold, slippery terrain, and a labyrinth of rocks and vegetation. Gradually, the national press began to move on. Reporters who had spent days in the mountains returned to their cities, and the headlines gave way to other stories. But in the Mantiqueira range, the disappearance of Carlos and Ana Clara once again became a recurring topic. It was as if the discovery had returned the mystery to the region's daily life, a mystery that lingered over every trail and every bend in the dirt roads. At Maria Helena's house, the recovered carrier seat was not present. It remained in the custody of the authorities for analysis, but she couldn't say if she ever wanted to see it again. "It's as if it were a piece of that day, frozen in time," she confessed. "I don't know if I'd have the courage to touch it." Maria Helena's life never returned to what it was. After the disappearance, she maintained her routine for a while, believing that Carlos and Ana Clara might reappear. She continued to work as a seamstress from home, serving old clients, but her daughter's room remained untouched. The pink walls were still adorned with animal stickers, and on a shelf, a small teddy bear waited. In the early years, Maria Helena visited the Serra da Mantiqueira frequently. She would go to the spots where the searches had concentrated, talk to guides and residents, and return home with more questions than answers. But with each passing year, the visits became rarer until finally she began to avoid the region altogether. The discovery of the carrier seat, 7 years later, was like tearing open a wound that had just begun to scar. The object brought a jolt of reality, the certainty that father and daughter had been at that very spot. At the same time, it reignited the anguish of what might have happened next. Maria Helena received support from friends and family, but there were also the curious who showed up only to ask for details of the case, as if it were a fictional story and not her real life. For Carlos's brother, Jose Martins, the news was equally difficult. He remembered the day he had helped with the 1996 search, trekking the trail in borrowed boots and an old flashlight. He recalled the weight of the silence when, at the end of each day, they returned with no leads. Seeing the carrier seat after so many years was like returning to that very first day of searching. The same feeling of emptiness. The family tried to move forward in practical ways. Carlos's documents were kept in a wooden box along with photographs, newspaper clippings, and a few personal effects. Among them was a pocket knife he used on the trails and a keychain with a miniature classic car. For Maria Helena, each item was a link to a past she could no longer live, but could never forget. The community of Taubaté, which had followed the case closely, organized a mass shortly after the object was rediscovered. The small hall was packed. The lit windows illuminated silent faces as a framed photo of Carlos carrying Ana Clara in the seat was placed near the altar. There were no long speeches, only a moment of collective remembrance marked by the sound of the wind drifting through the open windows. Meanwhile, the police reported that they were still analyzing the carrier seat and the items found inside it. The child's jacket was carefully cleaned and photographed, and the flashlight, despite the rust, still had part of its lens intact. The packet of candies, aged and hardened, was preserved as evidence. None of these items, however, provided any additional clues about what happened after the disappearance. Over time, routine once again took hold. Maria Helena kept her house organized and continued to sew, but she began to refuse interviews. She no longer wanted to see her face associated with headlines. For her, the public exposure only amplified the pain. Still, she kept a folder with every news report, as if one day she might reread each line and find something that had been missed. Her closest friends noticed that, despite her calm demeanor, Maria Helena lived in a state of constant alert. Any news of accidents in the mountains or disappearances brought back memories of November 9th, 1996. She said it was like living with a door to the past always ajar. Even after 7 years and the discovery of the carrier, the dates connected to the case remained marked on the family's calendar. In November, the silence in the house was heavier. Jose, her brother-in-law, would light a candle in the backyard, gazing at the distant mountains. "It's as if somehow they are still out there waiting to be found," he would say. The carrier seat, kept in custody, was never returned. Maria Helena never asked for it back, and perhaps never will. "I don't want it in my house like a ghost," she said. "I'd rather remember the days it carried my daughter, not the way they found it." The Serra da Mantiqueira holds many stories, but few have left a mark as deep as the disappearance of Carlos, Eduardo, and Ana Clara. After the carrier seat was found, the case became a reference point whenever the topic of trail safety arose. Guides and instructors began to use the episode as an example of what can happen when nature is underestimated, even by experienced people. In Campos do Jordão, a mountaineering association held a series of public lectures the following year. Among maps and photos projected on the wall, Carlos's name appeared alongside warnings about the importance of sharing your route before starting a hike, carrying proper equipment, and maintaining regular contact with someone at the base. Although the goal was to prevent new accidents, the constant reminder also kept the unsolved mystery alive. Municipalities in the region began installing signs on the most popular trails. Small yellow arrows painted on rocks and tree trunks indicated the correct direction, and metal plaques warned of sudden weather changes. In some sections, ropes were fixed to assist with ascents and descents, especially on steep parts near cliffs. Despite this, older residents remembered that in 1996, none of this existed. Anyone who entered the forest depended solely on prior knowledge and instinct. The case also sparked the interest of researchers. A group of geographers from the University of São Paulo visited Pedra da Fenda and the surrounding areas to map the geology and rock formations. The crevice where the carrier seat was found, they concluded, was the result of millions of years of erosion and tectonic movement, creating nearly parallel walls that narrowed at the bottom. Retrieving something from it would require specialized equipment or a great deal of luck. Among the locals, the impact was more emotional than technical. Those who live in the Mantiqueira have learned to coexist with the duality of beauty and risk. The same landscapes that attract tourists also hide natural traps: slopes covered in foliage, loose stones, streams that turn into raging currents after a rainstorm. The disappearance of Carlos and Ana Clara reinforced that awareness. Some of the older guides still recalled how the news of the carrier seat had shaken everyone. One of them, Sr. Miguel, said he could never again pass the route near the crevice without thinking of that image. "We learn to respect the mountain," he would say. "She is in no hurry to reveal her secrets." Meanwhile, the case remained officially open. The 2003 report documented the discovery of the object, but concluded there was insufficient evidence to determine what had happened. This void allowed the conversations to continue, and the story was passed down from generation to generation, gaining new listeners with each tourist season. At the market in São Bento do Sapucaí, it was common to hear a visitor ask about the carrier seat trail, and local artisans would point to the distant mountains that held the scene of the mystery. Although the name was unofficial, it entered the local vocabulary, blending tragedy with curiosity. In the early 2010s, an independent documentarian even filmed interviews with residents. original search volunteers and the climbers who found the carrier seat. The material, however, was never officially released. Some believed it contained details of the investigation that were not meant for public disclosure. Others said it was simply a lack of funds to complete the project. For Maria Helena, this constant interest was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept the memory of her husband and daughter alive. On the other, it prevented her from finding closure. Whenever the case returned to the media, the same questions reappeared, along with looks of pity or morbid curiosity. And so, the Mantiqueira continued to shelter its mystery, as time piled new layers upon the old story. And among the cold stones and ancient moss, the crevice where the carrier seat was found remained. Immobile, silent, as if one day it might reveal more than it already had. For the three young climbers who found the carrier seat in July of 2003, the memory of that day remained vivid even years later. Raphael, the oldest, remembered the moment the light hit the beige fabric wedged between the rocks. "We were laughing, talking nonsense when suddenly the mood changed," he recounted. "It was like the air grew heavier." Daniel in turn said the most striking moment for him was seeing the child's jacket, stiffened by moisture. "There was no room to think of adventure," he said. "All you could think was that this belonged to someone who never came home." Lucas, the youngest, was the one who remained most silent in interviews. The one time he spoke publicly about it, he described the feeling of looking down and knowing, with absolute certainty, that he shouldn't touch a thing. At the time, the three were part of a climbing group that often explored lesser-known routes. They were young, curious, and fearless, accustomed to dealing with dangerous terrain. But after that day, their relationship with the mountain changed. Raphael began to stick to safer routes and avoided narrow crevices. Daniel, who once ventured out alone, started climbing only in groups. And Lucas gave up expeditions for a time, returning only years later. The impact wasn't just emotional. When the story broke, their lives were invaded by reporters, onlookers, and authorities. They spent days retracing their steps, pointing out exactly where they were when they saw the crevice, and describing what they felt. Raphael kept a notebook with sketches of the trail, arrows indicating directions and observations about the terrain conditions. During the investigation, they were called to testify more than once. The police wanted to know if they had moved anything before the teams arrived. The answer was always the same: no. "We knew what not to touch," Daniel explained. "We just looked and took pictures waiting for someone to come." The photographs taken that day became a cornerstone of the case file. They showed the child's seat wedged into the crevice, a toddler's coat dangling by one sleeve, and a rusted flashlight still clipped to a side pocket. The sharpness of the images highlighted the stark contrast between the weathered terrain and the almost pristine aluminum frame of the seat. As months turned into years, the media's interest waned, but the episode remained a constant presence in the climbers' conversations. Raphael would recount how, sometimes in the middle of a climb, he would be struck by the memory of looking down and seeing something that should not have been there. Daniel said that whenever he saw an abandoned object on a trail, be it a bottle or a piece of clothing, he would stop and wonder about the story behind it. Their relationship with Maria Helena was also marked by a quiet respect. When they first met, there were no prolonged hugs or emotional speeches, just a simple, direct acknowledgement. "Thank you for not ignoring what you saw," she said. The three men always refused to speculate publicly about how the child's seat had ended up in that spot, claiming they didn't want to fuel theories without proof. "We saw what we saw," Raphael summarized. "The rest is for the investigators." Still, in private, they admitted to being puzzled by the object's position. The crevice was not on the main route. Reaching it required a detour through a steep and uneven patch of terrain. It wasn't impossible, but it demanded effort and attention. Even after so many years, that day remained a watershed moment for them. Their relationship with the mountain was never the same. And for those who knew the story, the memory of three young men who went out for a climb and returned with a mystery on their shoulders was just one more piece of the puzzle that the Mantiqueira Mountains held. The arrival of the child seat and the other items at the forensics lab marked a new phase in the case. Everything was transported to the Institute of Criminology in Sao Paulo, where specialists began their meticulous work. The first step was to photograph each item from multiple angles, documenting every detail of wear, every stain, and its original position. The child seat, despite 7 years of partial exposure to moisture, was structurally sound. The aluminum showed signs of light oxidation, especially at the joints, but nothing that compromised its shape. The beige fabric was torn in areas of high friction, with dark stains suggesting prolonged contact with organic matter and damp soil. The blue straps, though faded, still retained some of their color. The child's coat was the item that drew the most attention. Made of light-colored wool, its texture was stiff, as if every fiber had been impregnated with dust and mineral particles. One button was missing, and the hem showed uneven wear. In the right pocket, they found a small, crumpled piece of paper, illegible, deteriorated by time and the elements. The aluminum and plastic flashlight showed advanced rust on its metal body. The batteries still inside had leaked, corroding part of the internal structure. Even so, the power button could still be moved. A sealed packet of candies had a hard, yellowed wrapper, but the printed letters were still legible, indicating the brand and flavor: strawberry. Forensic experts collected samples of soil and fragments of vegetation clinging to the fabric. The analysis indicated the presence of moss and lichens typical of damp, shaded areas, consistent with the inside of the crevice where the items were found. There was, however, no identifiable trace of human DNA, a frustrating outcome for the team. One detail stood out. On the lower part of the seat's frame, near one of the support rods, was a dark mark, almost like a deep scratch. Experts debated whether it could have been caused by an impact against the rock or by repetitive friction against a single point. Without context, it was impossible to determine if it had happened before or after the seat ended up in the crevice. For weeks, the items remained in the lab as preliminary reports were sent to the responsible police precinct. The press even reported that new clues could emerge at any moment. But as time passed, it became clear that the objects, though heavy with meaning, would not reveal what had happened on their own. For Maria Helena, waiting for the results was an agony. Every time the phone rang with a call from the authorities, her heart would race, imagining that she would finally have answers. Most of the time, it was just a technical update with no concrete developments. "It's like watching a very long film," she told a close friend, only to realize the ending will never come. The final forensics report, delivered months later, was cautious. It confirmed the family's visual identification, attested to the state of the objects, and described environmental conditions consistent with the discovery site. However, it pointed to no evidence that could determine the exact dynamics of the disappearance. For the investigators, the technical work was not in vain. Even without a resolution, the detailed records would serve as a reference if new evidence ever surfaced. But for the family, it was just another chapter in a mystery that refused to be solved. In the Mantiqueira Mountains, the crevice where the child seat was found remained untouched. Moss grew slowly, moisture lingered, and the silence was broken only by the occasional sound of a loose stone tumbling down the slope. And like so many other stories kept by the mountains, this one remained without a clear ending. leaving a space for doubt to live on among the trees and rocks. With the forensics report delivered and no new leads, the case officially began to grow cold. The responsible precinct kept the inquiry open, but in practice, active investigation became more and more sporadic. The disappearance of Carlos and Ana Clara was relegated to file drawers alongside other unsolved mysteries of the region. For the residents of the Mantiqueira range, however, the story remained alive. A tourist had only to ask about hiking trails for someone to mention the trail of the child seat. Experienced guides told the story as a cautionary tale. The mountain doesn't forgive a moment's distraction. For the younger generation who hadn't lived through 1996, the case sounded like a modern legend, but one stripped of the supernatural. There was only the cold reality of an unsolved enigma. In Taubaté, Maria Helena adapted to this constant presence. At first, she tried to avoid conversations about it. Over time, she realized it was impossible. When she went out shopping, she would run into acquaintances who, even with the best intentions, would end up mentioning Carlos or Ana Clara. Some offered words of support, others uncomfortable questions. Do you think they're still out there? Or what if it wasn't an accident? Maria Helena would respond with a brief smile, but inside she was reliving the scenes of 1996 and 2003. In her neighborhood, the closest neighbors developed a silent pact. Don't bring it up, unless she wanted to talk. Still, there were moments when the subject would surface without warning. A news report on dangerous trails, the distant sound of church bells marking the time they had left that November morning, or even the smell of damp earth after a rain. Anything could trigger a memory. Jose Martins, Carlos's brother, kept up the tradition of hiking part of the trail once a year. He didn't go as far as the crevice. He would stop at a viewpoint halfway up. There he would stand for a few minutes in silence, looking out over the valley. "It's not a search," he would say. "It's just a way to be closer." In São Bento do Sapucaí, some shopkeepers discreetly used the case as a tourist attraction, mentioning the story to visitors looking for historic roots. This practice bothered some in the community who saw it as a lack of respect for the family. Others argued it was a way of keeping the memory alive. Gradually, the national press stopped looking for updates. Occasional articles were published only on anniversaries, 10 years, 15 years since the disappearance, always with the same headline, "A mystery that endures, defying time." On these occasions, the photos of the child seat would circulate again, and with them, the familiar ache for Maria Helena. Despite the official silence, the case still attracted the interest of amateur investigators. Some hiked the trail on their own, trying to find spots that might have been overlooked. Others studied maps and old accounts, searching for inconsistencies. None of it led to concrete results, but the activity reinforced the idea that the story was not completely over. In the mountains, nature continued its slow work. Fallen branches accumulated on rocks, vegetation closed in on secondary paths, and the crevice of the child seat remained unchanged, except for the moss that advanced year after year. With each passing season, it was as if the mountain were carefully covering the marks of the past, in no hurry to reveal what it kept hidden. For the family, the lack of answers was no longer a surprise. The pain had transformed into a quiet presence, a constant backdrop to daily life. And so, even without news, the disappearance of Carlos and Ana Clara remained part of the Mantiqueira's identity, an open chapter that time itself has not yet managed to close. The years following the official slowdown of the investigation were marked by isolated attempts to reignite the search. In 2006, a group of volunteer mountaineers organized an independent expedition. They used GPS, topographic maps, and climbing gear to cover areas that had been sparsely explored at the time of the disappearance. They found only the remnants of old campsites, dented cans, pieces of tarp, extinguished fire pits, with no direct link to Carlos and Ana Clara. 2 years later, a rescue team from Minas Gerais conducted a training exercise in the Mantiqueira and included a sweep near the crevice. The objective was twofold: to hone rescue techniques in rugged terrain and at the same time, to see if anything new had surfaced. Nothing was located. "The mountain has already swallowed any clue that might have been left," one of the instructors commented. Despite this, the story did not fade from collective memory. In Taubaté, young people who were children at the time of the disappearance grew up hearing the narrative as a warning. Some became guides or firefighters, motivated by a desire to prevent others from going through the same ordeal. One of them, Rogerio, remembered seeing posters with the photos of Carlos and Ana Clara taped to poles near his school. Years later, as a certified guide, he hiked the trail countless times, always with heightened awareness on the most dangerous sections. In 2011, a documentary on a cable channel brought the case back into the media spotlight. Featuring interviews with family, volunteers, and experts, the program reconstructed the disappearance and the discovery of the child seat. The aerial footage of the area left a powerful impression on the public. In the following days, Maria Helena received messages from strangers offering help or sharing theories. Most were well-intentioned, but some contained painful speculation. Time, however, remained the primary obstacle. The trails change with the seasons, trees fall, slopes collapse, streams alter their course. What was an open path in 1996 could be choked by dense vegetation just a few years later. And each natural alteration made any attempt to reconstruct the route Carlos took that day even more difficult. Maria Helena no longer went up the mountain. She preferred to hold on to the memories of when the family would go for picnics in open fields, filled with the scent of wet grass and the sound of running streams. "I don't want my last memory to be of searching for him and finding nothing," she would say. Jose continued his annual walk to the viewpoint. In recent years, he began taking his teenage son with him, explaining every detail of the landscape and pointing to the mountains that formed the horizon. "It's not about finding," he would repeat. "It's about remembering." Among the guides and locals, the consensus was that the case of Carlos had become part of the Mantiqueira's modern folklore, not as a ghost story, but as a true, breathing tragedy that echoed through generations. The child's seat, stored away in the archives, was often mentioned as a silent testament to a moment when they were tantalizingly close to an answer. As the year 2020 loomed, the disappearance was nearing a quarter of a century. To many, the hope of a new clue had all but faded. But in the Mantiqueira Mountains, the unlikely was never entirely impossible. And as the wind swept across the high grasslands and mist crept up the slopes, there were still those who believed the mountain held its secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. When the disappearance marked its 20th year in November of 2016, the atmosphere in the Mantiqueira was one of late spring, with warm afternoons and cool nights. During this time, a regional newspaper published a special report revisiting the case. The article featured a timeline with photos of the couple, the hikers who last saw them, images from the 1996 searches, and finally a photograph of the child's seat in the crevice. The story reignited memories for many residents. People who had taken part in the searches began to share messages and old photographs. Some showed Carlos at neighborhood parties, others on family outings by the region's rivers. These memories reinforced the image of a quiet man devoted to his daughter with a passion for the mountains. Maria Helena read the article calmly, alone in her kitchen. She made a point of carefully folding the newspaper and placing it in the same folder where she kept other clippings. As she turned the pages, she felt the pain resurface, sharp and sudden like a cold draft through a crack in the wall. In recent years, she had found small ways to move forward. She began meeting with friends again, took short trips, and started sewing clothes for charity. And yet, she avoided any trail or outing that reminded her of the Mantiqueira terrain. "It's as if my body knows that place is not for me," she would say. Jose, on the other hand, maintained his connection with the mountains. On the 20th anniversary of the disappearance, he climbed to the viewpoint once more. He brought a small photo of Carlos and Ana Clara, sealed in a plastic bag. He tied it to a branch overlooking the valley, where it could catch the wind. "It's not an altar," he explained. "It's just so the wind can remember them too." That same year, a group of foreign adventurers passed through the region. Upon hearing the story, they wanted to visit the crevice. Guided by locals, they reached a safe observation point from where they could see the narrow, dark opening. The silence that fell over them was the same that always enveloped those who came near. "It's like looking at a secret that doesn't want to be told," one of the visitors remarked. The outside interest reignited the debate over whether the area should be open to controlled tourism. Some argued it could generate funds for trail maintenance and safety. Others defended it as a place of memory that should remain restricted. In the end, the decision was made to keep things as they were, accessible only to authorized guides and experienced groups. As the months passed, the subject faded back into the rhythm of daily life. But for those who lived in the Mantiqueira, you didn't need an anniversary to remember. The case had become part of the landscape, as much as the sound of the wind in the araucaria pines or the fog rolling up the slopes at dusk. Maria Helena knew that answers were unlikely. "It's no longer about finding out what happened," she told a friend. "It's about accepting that life moved on, even with their absence." Still, she kept a space in her heart for the improbable, the kind of thing that sometimes appears in the lives of those who have never completely lost hope. Time is relentless. The mountains remain, but people change, grow old, follow different paths. The Serra da Mantiqueira, with its imposing beauty and deep valleys, continued to be a stage for hikes, campouts, and stories told around a fire. Among those stories was the disappearance of Carlos Eduardo Martins and his daughter Ana Clara. The wind still whistled softly as it passed through the crevice, its echo carrying through the damp rocks. For those who knew the story, every detail of that landscape carried weight. Maria Helena rarely spoke of the matter, but in a rare interview for a local history project, she said, she didn't want the final image of Carlos and Ana Clara to be that of an unsolved mystery. "I want to remember them laughing," she affirmed, "walking together, looking at the mountains as if they were looking at a beautiful future." Jose continued his annual tradition at the viewpoint, now accompanied by his adult son. In silence, they would watch the mountains and let the wind carry the memories. There were no speeches, no formal goodbyes, just the quiet acknowledgement that some stories don't need an ending to continue to exist. In the community, the case remained a benchmark for caution and respect for the mountain. Guides still mentioned the trail of the child's seat to warn hikers of the risks. And though many visitors sought out the location out of curiosity, most left with a feeling of reverence, as if they had stepped on sacred ground. Officially, the disappearance remains unsolved. No new evidence has ever surfaced. No unexpected revelations have been made. But for those who lived through it, the absence of an answer is not the same as forgetting. On the contrary, it is the silence itself that keeps the memory alive. The mystery of Carlos and Ana Clara has become part of the Mantiqueira's identity. It lives in the conversations of the locals, in the stories parents tell their children before a hike, in the quiet pauses before a steep drop. And perhaps it will remain there, kept safe between the trees, the rocks, and the fog until one day, something more comes to light.